Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the webinar of the Research Facility on Inequalities. I'm Amanda David, IFD Lead Economist on Inequality and the Scientific Coordinator of the program. This facility is funded by the EU and implemented by IFD, comprises of more than 20 research projects on inequality, and we have launched this webinar series in order to present some of the results. We are therefore inviting you to join us every Monday at 5 p.m. Paris time and talk about inequality. Just before we start, a few guidelines on the webinar. As you see on the right of the screen, you have a question feature where you can type your questions. The panelists will respond them after the presentation. And you have to keep in mind that all the questions are public and you can vote for those you think are more relevant. After the presentation, I will select some of them and address them to our speaker. Finally, the webinar is recorded and the replay will be available soon. And for those of you who could not join us for the previous sessions, on our webpage, you can find some very interesting discussions on inequality and earnings inequality in South Africa, on perceptions of inequality in Mexico, and also on inequality and access to urban water services in Bolivia. Today, we welcome Marin Ferry, who will be presenting a paper on how spatial inequality in terms of public service provision can shape attitudes towards taxation in sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Marin, and you have 30 minutes.
Thank you, Amanda. So, hello, everyone, and thank you for being online. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm really pleased to be here to present this paper, which is actually a joint work with Lisa Chauvet and Laure Pasquier-Doumer from the IRD and with Siavash Islami from the University of Paris. So as you can guess with our title, our paper investigates the relationship between subnational inequality in terms of public good provisions and individual attitude towards taxation in the particular context of Africa. But before looking directly at this relationship, let's first give a little bit of background. So our motivations set in the 2015 conference about financing for development that took place in Addis Ababa, where the resulting action agenda highlighted how crucial the mobilization of domestic resources would be for developing countries in order to finance the ambitious SDGs. But we know that despite significant improvements in tax collection, widespread tax evasion still makes the mobilization of domestic resources challenging for most of the developing countries and for African states in particular. And we also know that actually tax evasion issues are not new and not limited to developing countries. So that's why a lot of researchers dedicated part of their work to understanding the determinants of tax evasion and so the determinants of tax compliance. So the first findings that emerged from this literature about tax compliance determinants relates to what we call the traditional model of tax evasion, defined by Allingham and Senmo in 1972. In their model, the authors consider a taxpayer as a risk-averse individual, facing a trade-off between the benefits of avoiding taxes and the costs associated with non-compliant behavior. And basically, their model predicts that a larger penalty and a higher probability of detection would lead to a reduction in tax evasion. So this seminal work hence provide the first determinants or first mechanism explaining tax compliance that is known as the economic deterrence channel. So this approach of tax compliance prevailed for a while before other researchers start looking at the non-pecuniary factors explaining tax compliance. So there have been some identified in the existing literature, and we can gather all these pecuniary factors, non-pecuniary factors, and they are not encompassing concept named tax morale or attitude towards taxation, which has been shown as definitely shaping tax compliance behavior. Among these non-pecuniary factors, we have first, for instance, the fiscal exchange mechanism that basically implies that a taxpayer will display a more favorable attitude towards taxation if she or if he perceives that he perceives the benefits that he or she can get out of paying taxes, namely the provision of public goods and services. The other mechanisms is called the social influence channel and implies that makes the assumption that a taxpayer is largely influenced by the behavior of his or her peers. So the idea is that if a taxpayer observes that his or her peers do not comply with taxation, then it will probably affect his or her non-compliant behavior as well. Thirdly, we have the comparative treatment channel, which relates to some extent to the social influence channel. So in this mechanism, we assume that taxpayers will be affected by an unfair treatment from the fiscal authorities. And if this taxpayer, for instance, perceives or feels that he or she is unfairly treated by the fiscal authorities, as compared to other people or as compared to a specific group of people, for instance, high-income earners, then it will also negatively affect his or her tax compliance behavior. And lastly, we have a fourth channel, which is named as the political legitimacy channel, and which implies basically that people usually comply more with taxation when they trust their government. So as you can see, there have been some mechanisms identified within the existing literature, but none of them actually specifically look at the effect of inequality on attitudes towards taxation. So that's why we think that it would be interesting to investigate such relationship. So how could inequality influence attitudes towards taxation? So on one hand, we can first build on the behavioral research, which suggests that growing economic disparity and therefore growing inequality contributes to accentuate taxpayer stress, therefore increasing the propensity to evade. And this research have shown that this relationship between inequality, taxpayer stress, and propensity to evade mostly occurs at the both extremes of the income distribution because of the reduced visibility of transactions at these both extremes. For instance, for low-income earner, it will be due to the share of the informal economy, and for the high-income earner, it will be mainly due to type of optimization strategies in avoiding taxes. So there have been some evidence showing that indeed income inequality seems to be negatively associated with tax compliance and so positively associated with tax evasion, both in the context of developed economies such as the US, but also in the context of developing countries such as Latin American or Eurasian countries. On the other hand, however, we can also build on the median voter literature. Really briefly, the median voter model predicts that a higher level of inequality would imply a higher level of demand for redistribution. Therefore, if we think at attitudes towards taxation or tax compliance in a greater extent as a proxy for the demand for redistribution, we could expect to find a positive relationship between inequality and attitudes towards taxation. Yet, among this specific literature, the results are mixed because some researchers have found some support for the existence of median voter mechanisms, such as Milanovic in the context of developed and transition economies. But some others have found a negative association between inequality and demand for redistribution, especially in the context when comparing the US and European countries. And this research suggests that it could be due to the perception of social mobility that differs between these two type of countries, or the power of the ruling elites. A last paper that is really interesting for our study is the paper by Grunder and Kollner, which provides evidence of median voter mechanisms, but which also explains that the effect of inequality on redistribution could be more tenuous in developing countries because of weaker political rights. So in the context of African countries, we could expect to find less extent for the median voter mechanism because of lower citizens' voices. So in our study, we examined this relationship using the round 6 of the Afrobarometer surveys, which provide a lot of information regarding attitude towards taxation, so at the individual level. And then we focus on the effect of spatial inequality. Spatial inequality in our paper is constructed from nightlight data, and we thought it would be interesting to build on this nightlight data, first of all, because of the level of disaggregation, which is really interesting, and also because nightlight data, and moreover, inequality in terms of nightlight data, can be considered as a proxy for the spatial extent of public good provision. So in our paper, we're going to look at different levels of spatial inequality. First, we're going to start focusing on the subdivision level, which is the first administrative region level. Then we will also look at alternative and lower levels of inequality, because we think, in the same vein as Newman and co-authors, that perception of inequality is more likely to be accurate in the surrounding environment of respondents, because they can assess the extent of inequality based on their day-to-day observations. The main findings of this paper are that inequality in a 30 up to 60 kilometers surrounding has a positive association with attitudes towards taxation. Therefore, we interpret this result as a positive effect of subnational inequality on demand for redistribution. Yet, when we investigate the non-linearities within this particular relationship, we observe that this effect, this positive effect of inequality, can actually vary depending on some individual characteristics, such as the position in the distribution of the wealth. We indeed find that the poorest segments of the population are more supportive of taxation in presence of high inequality. And we also observe that the effect of inequality depends on the individual trust in the government or in the fiscal department, and also on the individual perception of the democratic conditions in the country respondents are living. So turning to our empirical strategy, our model is pretty simple. So on the left-hand side, our dependent variable is attitudes towards taxation that is observed for each individual I in buffer zone Z in a country C. And on the right-hand side of the equation, so our variable of interest is inequality, so spatial inequality. We also control for some characteristics at the zone level, for characteristics at the individual level that might also affect the attitudes toward taxation, such as, for instance, the various channels that I have introduced at the beginning of the presentation, and also for some individual characteristics that could also affect attitudes towards taxation, such as the age, the employment status, or the educational level. So the first unit of analysis of our study is the individual level. We have a little bit more than 37,500 individuals that are observed either in 2014 or in 2015, depending on the survey years of the country. And these individuals are spread over 362 first administrative regions, or across more than 4,000 buffer zones, in 30 African countries. So regarding our dependent variable, we could have looked at tax compliance in itself, because within the Afrobarometer survey, there is a question capturing tax compliance, which is basically, over the past year, did you pay your taxes or not? But we think that this question is relatively sensitive, and that this question could have basically suffer from an over-declaration bias. So that's why we prefer to look at attitudes towards taxation. So our measure of attitudes towards taxation is basically the average of the following 5 questions. first question is, do you think it is right or wrong to not pay taxes? Do you think, the second question is, do authorities always have the right to make people pay taxes? The third one is, do you think that citizens must pay taxes versus there is no need to tax the people? The fourth question is a good citizen that pays the taxes in a democracy? And lastly, the fifth question is, would you be okay, pay more taxes if it were to increase health spending? So we use the average of the following 5 questions that we have rescaled from 0 to 1. So the interest of the Afrobarometer surveys is that they provide the latitude and the longitude for each enumeration area, which therefore allows us to geolocalize each respondent. As you can see with this map, most of the respondents are located on the eastern and southern part of Africa, some other, a great proportion on the western part of Africa, and lastly, we have some respondents in the North Africa. So then, turning to our measure of spatial inequality, so this is basically a spatial Gini based on nightlight per capita using the VIRS data. So as I said, we're going to focus on various levels of spatial inequality at the first administrative region, but also at alternative boundaries. So how do we construct our spatial Gini? So first of all, as I said, we retrieve the latitude and longitude of each enumeration area in order to geolocalize each respondent. Then we construct a buffer area around each respondent for various radii, for instance, from a radius that starts at 20 kilometers up to a 70 kilometers radius. Then we impose a 1 kilometer square fishnet on light data on the zone in order to extract the value of the light for each pixel within the zone. Next, we divide this value of the light at the pixel level by the population within this pixel using the grid population world data. This allows us to have the level of night light per capita at the 1 kilometer square pixel level. So now, since we have both the population and the value of the light at the pixel level for each pixel, so we are able to rank inhabitants within the zone according to the value of the light they are exposed to, and therefore to compute the Gini, which gives our measure of spatial inequality. So for instance, if we first look at spatial inequality at the first administrative region level, you can see that our Gini is pretty satisfied, because if you start looking at the center region, the one with a Gini index of 0.56, we can see that the level of inequality is pretty low, basically because everybody has light. Okay, if we next look at the region below this region, we have another pretty low Gini of 0.58, which implies that there is not much inequality, right? And this is mainly because despite having less light within the region, light seems to be pretty homogeneously distributed within this region. If we then look at the region on the right hand side of the center region, the one with a Gini index of 0.89, we observe that there is greater inequality within this region. Why that? Simply because most of the light is concentrated on the western part of this region, and light is therefore heterogeneously distributed within this region, giving rise for larger inequality. So we do the same thing for alternative buffer areas, as I said. So for instance, this is an illustration of the distribution of light in a 50-kilometer radius. And these various measures of inequality hence help us to observe and to assess the within country inequality in provision of public goods. As you can see, we have various cases with countries really plagued by inequality in provision of public goods, while some other are more homogeneous in terms of light provision, but it can be no light at all or homogeneously distributed lights. So going back to our identification strategy, so we try to control for variant sources of heterogeneity by including country fixed effect as well as urban versus rural fixed effect. But the inclusion of this fixed effect actually does not prevent to have other endogeneity concerns, such as, for instance, the omitted variable bias or reverse causality. Reverse causality can be of importance in our strategy because if we think that a lower level of attitudes toward taxation leads to less taxes that are collected, it will then negatively affect the provision of public goods, hence leading to larger level of inequality. So the dependent variable could affect our explanatory variable. So in order to tackle and to address this endogeneity concern, we resort to an instrumental variable approach. So we compute the Gini index, so the inequality measure in the same form, but instead of using the observed light, we use the light predicted by an agglomeration model. The idea is that since we can observe the light at the pixel level, we think that if a pixel 14 years ago was non-lit, so without light, and really close to a lit pixel in 2000, then this pixel would be more likely to be lit in 2014. Conversely, a pixel that is really far away from the closest lit pixel would be less likely to be lit in 2014. Therefore, we predict the level of light for each pixel in 2014 with the distance, the straight distance of this pixel to the closest lit pixel in 2000. So this is our instrument so far. We are starting to look at another instrument which would be based not on the straight distance, but on the road distance. So turning to the results, and let's first have a look at the OLS estimate. So within the OLS estimate, it seems that inequality, spatial inequality, when it is measured at a pretty aggregated level, is not correlated with attitudes towards taxation. As you can see, the coefficient for spatial inequality measured at the first administrative region level and in a buffer area of 70 kilometers is not correlated at all with attitudes towards taxation. Looking at this result, it seems that the correlation mostly occurs at lower level of inequality. So subnational inequality, really local in a buffer area of 20 kilometers up to 50, 40 kilometers. Our model is also we think that our model is pretty well specified as all the coefficients associated with the various channels that I have introduced at the beginning of the presentation display the expected sign and are mostly significant. Turning then to the IV results, we observe that the effects of subnational inequality at really lower level, such as 20 kilometers or 50 kilometers, remain significant. And we also observe that the magnitude of the coefficient is now larger than the one we observed for the OLS estimate, suggesting the downward bias that we basically expected given the correlation between the dependent variable and our explanatory variable. Another interesting information based on this table is that our identification strategy is also pretty satisfying since we have a pretty good explanatory power of our instrument and that the Klebinger PAP statistic display the right value as well. So next, we ran some robustness checks in order to challenge these findings. So we estimate such relationship, our previous specification with alternative dependent variables. We also try alternative level of clustering for the standard errors. And in order to be sure that the average effect that we observe is not driven by one particular country, we rerun the IV and OLS estimates, but dropping each country one by one. And in overall, all these robustness checks support the main findings. Then we try to go a little bit deeper on this relationship between inequality and attitudes toward taxation by investigating potential nonlinearities. We first try to look at differentiated effects of inequality with respect to the position of respondents in the wealth distribution. So we have information about the assets of each respondent. So we compute an asset index and then obtain the wealth distribution for each respondent at the national level. So interacting our measure of inequality with the quantile of each respondent, we observe that the positive effect of inequality on attitudes towards taxation is mostly driven by people lying at the bottom of the wealth distribution, namely people belonging to the first and second quantile of wealth, which goes in favor of the median voter model, as people that seems to suffer the most from inequality are those which display the larger demand for redistribution, if we think that attitudes toward taxation can be a good proxy for demand for redistribution. In the same way, we then try to look at the effect of inequality with respect to the distance of each respondent to the most developed area in the zone. The idea being that people that are located really close to a really lit area could benefit in some extent or in a way to these night lights. But people really far away, if they observe such inequality, would be more inclined to display a more favorable attitude towards taxation, and therefore a more attitude in the sense of the demand for redistribution. And this is basically what our results suggest as the interaction term between inequality and the distance to the pixel of the respondent with the most lit pixel in the zone is positive and statistically significant. Lastly, and in order to test for the state legitimacy channel or the political legitimacy channel that I have shown at the beginning of the presentation, we also look at the differentiated impact of spatial inequality with respect to the individual perception of the government's ability to provide public goods and the perception of the extent of democracy. So first, we interact our measure of inequality with various variables capturing the individual trust to the governments or the fiscal authorities. And we observe that inequality, the positive effect, of inequality is reinforced when people trust their institutions. Conversely, we also observe that this effect of inequality actually lessens when people perceive a greater extent of corruption among the institutions. And lastly, in the same way as the paper by Grindel and Kollner that I have introduced at the beginning of the presentation as well, we also try to look at the effect of inequality on attitudes towards taxation with respect to the individual perception of democratic conditions. And you observe that this effect is mostly positive when people are satisfied with the democracy within the country they live in. So, which also goes in favor of both this state legitimacy channel, but also in the sense of the median voter model. So just to conclude, our paper and our study suggest that subnational inequality is positively associated with attitude in favor of taxation. So as I said before, we interpret this result as a positive effect of local spatial inequality in 30 up to 60 kilometer buffer areas on demand for redistribution. And we think that alongside the inequality measured at the aggregated level, inequality should also be measured over an area that is perceivable for individuals. Lastly, we have been able to identify some interesting non-linearities into this relationship, such as that this positive effect of inequality, of subnational inequality, depends on the individual position in the distribution of wealth, on their distance from the most developed area in the zone, also on their trust in government and their perception of corruption, and also that this effect is reinforced when people have a pretty good perception of the extent of the democracy in the country they are living in. And just to conclude, in overall, our paper in terms of policy recommendation, we think that in poor African countries where the fiscal capacity is still very low, one way of strengthening the citizens' tax compliance will be to massively invest in the allocation of public good provision, of public goods, that reduce inequality. And we think that poor citizens located really far away from the economic centers should be targeted first by the allocation of such public goods. And I thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to take some questions if there is any.
Thank you so much. I see that we already have a question, and I have also my questions as I can't type them there. And for all of our participants, feel free to ask your questions in the question feature, which is just on the right of the screen. So I see that Jackson had a question on the methodology and the sampling of the respondents. I think that would be interesting to address. And I also had a question on whether you have information maybe on the elections part, because I think that one thing that might impact attitudes towards taxation, also the perceptions of inequality, is, for instance, the proximity to elections, because what we have seen in other contexts, for instance, is that whenever an election arises, or is quite close, a lot of info is given on the level of inequality. Like there's a lot of communication around how many schools there are, how many hospitals are available, and so on. And this actually increases citizens' awareness of their access to services, but also on the level of inequality. So if an election, or a local election, for instance, was closer to the time of the survey, this might also have an influence on their attitudes.
Okay. Thank you for this really interesting question, Anda. I'm going to start answering your question, and then I will try to answer the Jackson's question. Okay, yes, I think it's a really good and interesting point. I'm not sure that we have this information in the Afrobarometer survey, but I'm pretty sure that we can get this information using other type of data. The only thing is that we could only control for the proximity to election. Since we are working with cross-sectional data, and since we have only one point in time per country, so per respondent, we won't be able to capture this type of political cycles in this relationship between inequality and taxation. But we could definitely look at the effect of the proximity to local election. For national election, I think it's captures where the country fixed effect, but for the local election, if there is some variability in the timing of local election between regions, we could control for that. Otherwise, it would be the same timing for each region, and therefore I think captures by the country fixed effect. But definitely a really good point that I think we should investigate in the future version of the paper. Regarding the Jackson question, so it's a methodological question regarding the sampling of the respondents into the Afrobarometer survey. I'm not really, I know that basically the survey are only nationally representative, so not regionally representative. So the people that are doing Afrobarometer survey are randomly sampling the people around the country, with some in the various regions of the country. But I'm not sure if I answer properly to the question, but this sampling, I think, is taken at the national level. That's why the Afrobarometer survey data are only representative at the national level and not at the regional level. So I don't think that there is random draw of respondents within each region, but mostly that this random draw occurred at the national level. I hope I have clarified your point.
Okay, thank you so much. And one of my other questions was more on the quality of public services, because I guess that the nightlight data does not give you too much information on the quality. I was wondering if other studies have tried to see which is the correlation with the quality and maybe the perception also of this quality.
Sorry, and I was just looking at the Jackson response. Could you just
No, I was just saying that what you see with the nightlight data is the dispersion of the public service provision, but you don't have info on the quality of those services. And I was wondering if other studies have looked at the correlation between this data and the quality of the service provision, and also other types of correlations like that of the perception of that quality or the use of the services.
Yes, to my knowledge, I think that the only studies that try to look at the relevance of using nightlight data at a really disaggregated level is that nightlight data is a good proxy for economic development. And nightlight data, therefore, in other studies, so basically the two studies that I have in mind is first that nightlight data are a good proxy for economic development at a really lower level, but that also nightlight can be a good proxy for public good provision. But nothing is said about the quality of such public goods. I'm not sure that we can cross the nightlight data with information regarding the quality of public goods and infrastructure into the Afrobarometer survey, because I'm not sure that there are some quality questions relative to the public goods provision. Maybe we have some question regarding the perception of the quality, which would be interesting, yes, to use. We have a question regarding the difficulty of accessing some public goods, such as health center or to getting some police services. But it's more on the access rather than on the quality of the service per se. But maybe we could just go back to the Afrobarometer survey and see if we can have some proxy for the quality of this kind of public goods that we are trying to proxy with nightlight data.
Thanks. And then I see that Mark also had a question on whether you could test if local authorities are pro or anti-government. So I guess that would require you to do a data assembling in order to build this new variable, but it would be nice if you could dwell a bit into this question.
Yes, regarding the Mark's question, it's moving, sorry. Yes, it would be definitely interesting to look at the how can I say that, the pro or anti-government behavior of the local authorities, but I don't know where we can find such information, because there is not specified if the respondent is, for instance, part of the local authorities, and therefore we cannot really assess his or her behavior as regard to the national government. Mark also underlined that it is important to take into account the various ethnic groups that could also influence such relationship. I think in a prior version of the paper, we control for the ethnic groups of each respondent, but there is a lot of ethnic groups within our samples. As you basically saw during the presentation, all the respondents are located really spread all over Africa. So when we did that, it led us to have a lot of ethnic groups fixed effect, but at least it was obvious to the inclusion of such fixed effects. But yes, it's a really valid point. I'm not sure that we can answer the Mark's concern regarding the local authorities and if they are pro or anti government. But it's a really good point as well.
And I think that Jackson actually stressed a little bit more his question, which might have more to do on presenting a bit the Afrobarometer data. Maybe if you can say a few words on that data, this might provide the answers needed.
Yes, I'm just looking at the other Jackson question.
Because it's how do you measure attitude and good provision? And tell us how the variable on the attitudes.
Yeah, this is basically cross-sectional data, as I said. So we have 1 point for each country in time. So either 2014 or 2015. Each respondent are observed one time. Okay, so we have each observation point is a respondent. And so, as I said, the attitudes are measured using relative questions relative to perception of taxation within the country for each individual. So we just get all these variables, then do the average over each for one respondent over each his or her various responses, and that's how we use the Afrobarometer data that are basically available on the Afrobarometer website. You can basically easily retrieve from the Afrobarometer website. And then if you want to have the longitude and the latitude of each respondent, you have to ask specifically to Afrobarometer, specifying the type of research you're conducting.
Great, thanks. And I see that Marie also has a question in terms of linking demand for redistribution with tax compliance, and whether asset-based policies would be a good tool to address this demand more directly.
Yes, definitely. But one of our results is that this demand for redistribution seems to stem more from the poorer people. And we don't think that it would be good to specifically target in terms of fiscal policy the poorer segment of the population. But yeah, definitely, I think the main thing is that contrary to tax compliance, our measure is attitudes toward taxation. So it does not ask directly, would you pay for instance, for better public good provision, but do you think people should pay? So it's not specifically you that should pay the taxes. So when the poorest segment of the population seems to display the larger demand for redistribution and the more favorable attitudes toward taxation, it doesn't mean that they are more inclined to pay the taxes themselves, but maybe that people in overall, and maybe people at the top of the income distribution should pay more taxes. So yes, and I think anyway the fiscal policy should be redistributive as much as it can. So an asset-based policy could address this demand more directly, I think.
And just before moving to the next question, I had a related one on whether you've looked at just correlations between or just look at the level of tax compliance with the results you get on attitudes towards taxation, country by country, and maybe try to see if you can find groups of countries in which the results from the Afrobarometer are closer to the real tax compliance, and maybe try to read your regressions based on those groups of countries.
Yes, we didn't do that, but it's a really good suggestion. You mean looking at the tax to GDP ratio, for instance, and to look at the countries where attitudes toward taxation is pretty favorable and in line with the level and the amount of tax that these countries are collecting? I think it will be interesting to do some specific subgroups, maybe when attitudes toward taxation is pretty close to, is positively correlated with tax to GDP ratio. But the thing is that we won't have any temporal variation because we are using cross-sectional data. So we will just be able to observe the spatial distribution within Africa between countries with indeed larger level of tax to GDP ratio and on average at the national level, more favorable attitudes toward taxation. But it would be interesting to do that.
And again, before just because that the new question it's also related to perceptions, I will leave Mark's question for answers in a few minutes, because Mary Murianga has a question on whether you consider the level of understanding of tax and taxation issues as a determinant of perceptions. So sort of tax literacy variable that could impact perceptions.
Okay, I don't have the, okay. Yes. I'm not sure that I properly read the question. The understanding of taxation, I think, is captured by the inclusion of educational level. And we try to in that sense, we try to control as much as we can for individual characteristics, trying to account for such factors. And basically people that do not really understand how tax and how tax payments work would therefore have a different perception of taxation. So I think we try to control as much as we can with the inclusion of individual characteristics variables, such as the level of education, maybe the literacy. The level of literacy, maybe, I'm not sure because we are entering many individual variables. But I'm pretty sure, I'm 100% sure that the level of education of each respondent is entered into the regression. So in a way, it should control for that.
Great. So now we can go back to Mark's question on the results of the elections, and whether you could try to use power cuts as a proxy for the quality of public goods.
No, we didn't do that, but it's a really valid point and good suggestions that we'll try to integrate in the further version of the paper, definitely.
And whether you could consider culture as a determinant of attitude perception. That's a more tricky question, I guess.
Yeah, because it implies to capture with some variables this culture, which can gather many aspects, many cultural aspects. So besides adding some ethnic groups dummy variables, it's a tricky question because I'm not really sure how we could capture the contribution of culture to the attitudes towards taxation and the other perception of individuals.
And I also think that the cultural traits are already taken into account in the country fixed effects.
Yes, definitely.
That you have.
Yep.
So I think that aspect is more or less covered in that sense.
Yeah, but we could still, it's an interesting question, and we could still interact this cultural aspect at the national level with some individual variables, such as, for instance, I mean, if we interact our measure of inequality, which is measured at lower level, at the national level, we could definitely interact this measure of inequality with cultural variable at the national level, such as cultural legacy or heritage, for instance.
That's true. And again, I'm going back to my idea of doing the regressions on different countries, but I don't know if you could get this information on episodes of acceleration in either the increase or the decrease in inequality, which might also impact the attitudes toward taxation. Because if you've been through a period in which inequality has increased a lot in your area, like let's say you have this territorial development policy in which one area of the country is favored, and you sort of feel that this might impact your attitude on taxation and redistribution. So I don't know if you could capture this.
Yes, I think we could. Yeah, I think we could. We could not observe the direct effect of that. Oh, yes, we could actually. If we measure the dynamics inequality at the zone level, since we do not use any zone level fixed effect, we could definitely look at that. So it will imply we can do that with night lights because we have data for night lights with a pretty satisfying temporal step back. So we could look at the evolution of, for instance, the Gini index, but it also implies that there is some temporal variation in quality, which has been shown that it's pretty flat over time. But if we manage to go back, I think we could go back to the 2000, between 2000 and 2013, not mix the data from various satellites, but we could have the annual average growth rates of the Gini, if you want to, over the past 10 or 14 years, and then add that to the regression as a control for the dynamics into the inequality at the zone level. And then also interact that with our inequality measure, which is measured contemporaneously, to see if it has some effect on the relationship we're focusing on. But it's a really good suggestion as well.
Okay, so I think that there are no further questions. So we'll probably stop here. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and a huge thank you to you, Marin, for presenting. Next week, we welcome you again at 5 p.m. Paris time, and next week we'll be talking to our colleagues from Oxfam on their project on the multidimensional inequality in West South Africa. Thank you again, and see you soon. Bye-bye.